Welcome to Central Christian Church in Brownsville, Texas. This is the first video in our Welcome to Central series, led by our pastor, Lance Hostetter. We've been serving Jesus and Brownsville for 110 years, and we're glad for the opportunity to tell you more about who we are and what we believe.
Hi, my name is Lance Hostetter, and I'd like to welcome you to our class for new members. We call it Welcome 101, and we're going to be looking at not only what Central Christian Church here in Brownsville's position is on different doctrinal issues, but it also is designed as an introduction to Christianity. Maybe you have a faith background. I think many of the people that watch this will have some type of church or faith background, and some of this information may be stuff you already know, but I hope you will benefit by watching the entire video series. And so we're going to begin by looking at the history of the Christian church, and more specifically Central Christian Church. Our plan as a body of believers, or our desire, is to get back to the Bible as our rule of faith and our rule of practice. And so if we had a key go-to verse that describes what it is that we're trying to do here, we would look at Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayers. The fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all, as anyone had need. So continually, daily, with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. As we begin talking about Central Christian Church, I think we should look at some of the foundations, or the foundation in which this church group began here in Brownsville. And Central Christian Church is historically rooted and a movement that began in frontier America, and even before that in the book of Acts, but here in America it became known as the Restoration Movement. Now I know most of you are familiar with the Reformation movement, in which Martin Luther, Zwingli, and others in Europe many years before tried to reform the Roman Catholic Church. But this movement is called the Restoration Movement. And it was just a unity movement in frontier America, in which Christians of all different backgrounds, different denominations, decided to try to get together and be unified here in America. It was part of a greater movement called the Second Great Awakening. And during those years, in what was considered the West, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, in those areas, they were having great revivals, and they would have week, 2 weeks, 3-week get-togethers. People, after they had gotten their crops in, would gather, ride their wagons there, ride their horses, walk any way they could, and there would be a lot of people coming together for singing, for fellowship, and for hearing the gospel. And out of this time period, we had some leaders that emerged, and the two most well-known are the Campbells and Barton W. Stone. The Campbells were theologians. They were Presbyterian background. Thomas and Alexander, his son. And then Barton W. Stone, I believe, had a Baptist background. And they began to come up with some of the same ideas about trying to just get back to the Bible and be Christians and Christians only. In those days, if you were going to preach in a particular denomination, You had to sign a contract that you accepted the creed of that denomination. And the Campbells, who were trained as Presbyterian ministers, had a real problem signing any contract. And so when they did sign to be ordained in the Presbyterian Church, they said that they wrote below their signature, as long as what they're signing is consistent with the Bible. Some people will call the Christian church or the disciples of Christ, the different groups that came from that restoration movement, they might call you a Campbellite. It's not something we want to be called, and it's not a name that we accept. We just want to be Christians and Christians only. And then within our movement, you might hear people say, I'm part of the Stone Campbell movement. And we try to stay away from any names. We only want to be known by the name of the one who died on the cross for our sins, Jesus Christ, and follow that practice. We see the church doing at Antioch when they were first called Christians. So what were some of the key beliefs that they worked out together? Some of the main ideas that caused them to want to be unified. Well, the first one is the name. What do we call ourselves? And we've talked about this already. But today we still have that plea to be Christians. People will ask you all the time, what denomination do you belong to? And I will say, I'm a Christian. And they say, well, I know that, but what particular denomination? And I just say, I'm just a Christian. And it kind of confuses people. So when people are asking you that, they want to hear, am I a Baptist? Am I a Lutheran? Am I evangelical? We don't call ourselves evangelicals, just Christians. Am I a fundamentalist because I believe in the fundamentals of the Bible? No, the name Christian is just good enough. The next thing they talked about was the idea of creeds. There's the Westminster Confession, there's the Apostles' Creed, and different denominations had drawn up what it is that they believe, and they had asked their members to sign a contract saying that they agreed with it. They would have the children memorize it. Maybe you grew up learning one of those creeds. It's good to define what it is that we know, and that's why creeds came about, to stop false doctrines from entering in and being taught in the church. But the early leaders of this movement thought it more important that we just use the Bible. Where the Bible clearly teaches, we teach, and where the Bible's clearly silent, let's be silent. And so they said, let's get rid of all of these creeds and just get to the Bible. Which brings us to the next idea. No book but the Bible. We have churches that have other books added to them, and other churches that have books of prayer and things like this that they require people to read and to follow. And we feel that the Scriptures are sufficient, that we can just use the Scriptures, going all the way back to the Reformation movement. That was a plea, and it still is today. Another unifying thought that they had was to be unified on essentials. Now, we do argue even today about what is essential and what is not. But there are a lot of things that churches argue about. For instance, eschatology, or the second coming. Am I a premillennialist, amillennialist, a postmillennialist, a post-premillennialist? There are all different types of beliefs when it comes to the return of Christ, the end of this world as we know it. And we don't require our membership to prescribe or subscribe to any of these definite end-time views. You might have a different view than someone else, but it's not an essential. So these early leaders that were coming together, they wanted to just define what it is that is essential and only require that. So on opinions, what type of clothes should we wear? The Amish, they have rules on what type of clothes a married man can wear and what type of clothes an unmarried woman can wear. We said we don't want all of that. We just want to leave room for Christian liberty and Christian freedom on these opinions. and teach only where we know the Bible clearly teaches. Which brings us to the next idea on opinions, liberty. And it's difficult sometimes to say, that's your opinion, this is my opinion, and let it go at that. We'll agree to disagree on this point. Another idea they had was that we need to get away from denominationalism, sectarianism. I'm of this one and I'm of that one. Paul talked about people saying, I'm of Apollos and I am of Jesus and I am of Paul, and that we need to just come together unified and remind each other that God wants there to be one body and one, as we call the church, the bride of Christ in the book of Revelation, instead of going after different denominational names. And you and I know that it's not a great testimony to go down any main street in America and you will see the greatest real estate in town owned by different churches, as though there was some type of competition going on where people became proud and wanted to build a nicer building than someone else. So we have to realize that to the unsaved world, they see all of this property, many times not open except on Sunday morning for a couple hours, and they question, why don't we pay taxes and why aren't we doing more? So disunity is not something Christ called us to. And the Roman Catholic Church is right in the name Catholic, meaning universal. God does want there to be one body, and we want to continue to try to emphasize that. So what are some other ideas they talked about to try to bring about unity? Well, one was the role of clergy. In many denominations, the clergy are on a pedestal, and I know that when you are called into ministry, people are going to look at you and they're going to expect you to set a high standard. But these early leaders believed that everybody should be able to be involved in the work of the church. You should be able to baptize people. You should be able to have a Bible study, prayer meetings, without being ordained by an official ecclesiastical leadership somewhere. They wanted to get what people have termed lay people involved in doing ministry. And that's how churches really go forward and grow. When you start talking to people and sharing your faith and leading them to the Lord, and this role of being in an official position where only the clergy or the eldership can give communion, can pray with people, can study with them, is not what we see in Scripture. So that was one thing that they wanted to end, the idea of clergy craft, or clergy being the only ones that can do so many of the different jobs. Another idea they came into agreement on was the idea of open communion. And I'll talk more about communion later on in this series. But they believe that the Lord Jesus Christ invites people to the communion table. It's His table. He established that ordinance, and He's the one that brings us there. And in the days of the frontier in America, in the 1800s, Christians that were not of a certain denomination could not take communion. So, for instance, if you were in Lincoln, Nebraska, way out there somewhere, and you had a minister come to town, and he was a Methodist, then only the Methodists in town could take communion when he set up a communion table. The same would be true if you weren't Presbyterian. And they thought, this is wrong. These people, they need to be allowed to come around the Lord's table, and anytime it's set up, Jesus is the one inviting. Another great idea they had was that the local church is to be led by a plurality of elders. And we see that taught in the Bible, and we'll talk about that more in the future. The eldership in America, we vote on elders based on what we hear in the Bible about choosing deacons from their flock. In the book of Acts, we see that it is the apostles, and we don't have apostles today because you have to be a witness of the resurrected Lord to have that title. But we see the apostles like Paul appointing the eldership in different churches. And Paul was adamant, and he desired to make sure all the early churches had leaders in them called elders, and they were local governing bodies. There was no headquarters in Rome or somewhere that dictated to these local believers what it is they can and cannot do, nor did they have to send their money off. Now, we know that they helped the church in Jerusalem out, and Ephesus and different places. They sent offerings to help out during a famine there in Jerusalem, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's one of the ideas that we see in the Bible that we're trying to continue here at Central Christian. We are a local body of believers who have no headquarters. We are here, and we are led by men that have been picked out by the leadership here and voted on by the congregation. All right, the next big issue that they struggled with was baptism. And so if I ask you, have you been baptized? It's more than likely, if you were raised in church, you'll say yes. So they sought to define biblical baptism, and they sought to give one definition. You know, if your kids are growing up, and if we sprinkled here babies, if we poured, if we immersed, it would be confusing. So getting back to the Bible, the Greek word baptism, or the Greek word baptizo, is a transliteration into baptism, and it simply means to immerse, to dip, or to plunge. And so they, after much study and much prayer, decided that that is something that we should be doing. And the Campbells, being Presbyterian, had a real struggle with this issue. Now, some would say, just get rid of baptism or accept all different modes and different types, and it would bring more unity. But in the end, I don't think it would. It's important that we try to follow the Scriptures as we try to be Christians only. So, at this point, I would like to just go over a brief summary. It may not seem brief if you're watching, but I'd like to go through the decades here at Central Christian Church. Since we've talked about the Christian church at large, I would like to focus more here on this local body of believers. And so the church was begun in 1910. There was a gentleman named Samuel Howland, and he got some people together, and he organized a church. And it's a long story, but the church was started as a Disciples of Christ, which was a break-off of the Restoration movement and had become a denomination. But he organized it, as most of the churches in Texas were in those days, as part of that denomination, the Disciples of Christ. I think it's interesting that he was 62 years old when he began this group of believers. And I believe they met in a butcher shop. I might need corrected on that. But he continued to lead this congregation until he was 89 years old. Another important moment in that decade, it says here in my notes that it started in the old meat market on 4th and Levy. And they were able to build a building there and purchase land, and the church continued to grow. They came up with a statement that would define what it is they were trying to do as believers here in Brownsville. And I think it's important, if you're going to be a member of this church, that you don't have to memorize this, but you have an understanding of our purpose statement. And that is, the purpose of this congregation shall be, as revealed in the New Testament, to win people to faith in Jesus Christ and commit them actively to the church, to help them grow in the grace and knowledge of Christ. And as they continued to grow in the 20s, one of the great events of that time was that they built a parsonage. That was a place for the minister to live, and they had different people come and be part of to lead the church. And then the Great Depression hit, one of the first big setbacks for Central Christian, as it was for many other churches. And they were able to build a building even despite that. And if you look at some of the giving at that time. They have records of it. It might be 10 cents a week or $1 a month that people were able to give. So they had great faith, and they built their first building down on 4th and Levy, which has since been sold to a different congregation after they moved here. The 40s, a lot was happening. The people that started this church, the Howlands, they gave their house to the church. They willed it to the church, and that money allowed the church to retire the debt on their building downtown on 4th and Levy. And that was right after World War II, or during that time period. Another lady that we should consider is Elma Ireland, and she was a missionary from Mexico. And she began an outreach in Brownsville to reach those that only spoke Spanish. And so they started a ministry in Harlingen, and the church supported that work. In those days, the community was a little more segregated than it is today. They formed a choir, they purchased an organ, and they even were able to buy a home next door to the church and convert it into a youth center. So a lot was going on in the 40s. The 50s, a lot happened then as well. Our country was doing well after the war, and many of the men had come home from serving our country and started young families. But they reached out once again to reach out into the Spanish-speaking community, and they borrowed money against their own building. And $25,000 was a lot of money in those days. And they started a new building, a new work here in Brownsville, which is still going today. And some other key events. They had a Boy Scout program. They had a ladies' welcome wagon that made 757 calls. It tells you how the community was growing. And they had over 250 people coming to Sunday school. So the church was really doing great in the 50s. But once again, they were set back, like during the Depression, by the closing of an oil plant here in Brownsville. And when it closed, if you can imagine, overnight, they lost 70 members of the congregation and 12 board members because they had to move or relocate to another part of Texas or elsewhere. In the 60s, with all the turmoil, one of the great landmarks of that time, not only did the congregation celebrate their 50th anniversary, but something I believe that should be celebrated, while there were some people that left because of it, was their breaking away from the denomination of the Disciples of Christ, and they became an independent Christian church. The disciples had become very political, and some of our elders, Dr. Jones especially, read a lot of the newsletters and was concerned about some of the things they were promoting, like communism and supporting certain political candidates. And Brother Ray Houston went to the Disciples Convention, and while he was there, he was upset with some of the things he heard. But he also learned about, from one of our Bible colleges, Milligan College, that there was an independent group of Christian churches out here that weren't linked to the denomination of the Disciples of Christ. So he came back and shared with the elders his thoughts, and also Dr. Coulter and these key leaders decided that it was time to send a letter and to break off that relationship and become an independent congregation, an independent Christian church. And after they did that, it gave them freedom to get involved in their own types of missions and not just send their money off to a mission team somewhere and hope that they distribute it after they would take some of the money out. And so they started going to visit different missionaries. And one of the first ones they visited was our own Spanish minister, Caleb Northrup's grandpa, Rodney Northrup. And they went down to Mexico and began to support his work in Saltillo, Mexico. The congregation in the 70s experienced another setback with the loss of a lot of families moving from Brownsville. They also were seeing a decline in their neighborhood. I'll tell you a kind of funny story. One time Dr. Jones, one of our leaders, was in the parking lot ushering people in, and he saw a couple of guys come through the parking lot, and he asked them what they were needing, and they said, "We need a Cadillac." And he said, "Well, there's one over there." And they said, "No, we need a black one. We have an order." So a lot of cars were being stolen in downtown Brownsville in the days before you had all these computer systems. They still are vulnerable in certain areas. So that caused them to want to start looking for more land and a better place to start a new congregation in the future. There's some other ideas you'll see on the screen there, but another important one to remember is that it was during the 70s that they paid off their loan they had taken out to start the Spanish-speaking congregation and to build the building. In the 80s, Dr. Melvin Newen, who happened to be the president of Dallas Christian College, was invited to come and called here to serve, and he stayed for over 20 years. And that's when they purchased this land during his tenure. And they also had what was called Miracle Sunday, and people made donations and pledged to give $104,000 on one Sunday to start buying this land and to also begin the process of building a new building here. And in the 90s, 1992, September 20th, they were able to break ground and begin construction. Or at least break ground. They began construction a couple of months later, and they finally, about a year later, were able to move into the new building that we have here. What happened in the 2000s, we had different ministers and youth ministers that served. We started another Spanish language service. We started a contemporary service. They had blueprints drawn up for a family life center, which we still have to this day. Mobs began meeting, and there are so many other things that happened during that time period. The worst of which, no, I'm just kidding, this congregation called Jennifer and I to come here in 2009. And so that's just a summary. Here recently, we've been able to update our building and do some much needed maintenance, and we're continuing to go forward. At this time, I want to show you a video. It's dated somewhat, but it also gives you some vision of what's happened in the past, and hopefully it'll encourage you to think about what's going to happen in the future. The church, like all churches, has seen its ups and downs, and this COVID virus is just one more thing we're having to deal with. But God is blessing us, and we're encouraged that you're interested in checking out this new members video, and I hope you'll continue learning more about our position and what it is that we believe here at Central Christian. I hope you have a blessed day. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.